Hello, my name is Paul Stenner. I'm a social psychologist and I work at the Open University in the United Kingdom. The Open University is a very large distance learning university. It's the biggest university in the UK in terms of student numbers. I've worked there for about 10 years and had different jobs before that as a social psychologist in other universities. Liminality is a concept that comes from the discipline of anthropology, and it's a concept that invokes ideas of ritual and rites of passage and so on. But it also has a basis in psychology, because people would call the sort of transition from a stimulus being unconscious to being conscious a liminal. A limen, the threshold is called a limen. So it's relevant as a concept for understanding the experiences people go through when they're undergoing significant changes in their life of whatever kind. It generalizes to lots of different kinds of changes. So that's the excitement of the concept, that possibly it's applicable to lots of experiences that lots of people have, and can help to illuminate how we as social psychologists understand those experiences, but also how they make sense of their own life conditions and changes. So that's the appeal of that concept. Well, one thing to say about crisis today is, it's relatively easy to observe that when people describe what's going on in the world today and they give a kind of general description, what kind of world are we living in? Nowadays, a lot of people are describing the world as a world in times of crisis. So we're entering kind of generalized time of crisis, and people are inventing new words, even like polycrisis, to talk about the fact that there are lots of different types of crises, but they're all interconnected. So the ecological crisis is connected to the industrial capitalism crisis, for example, and that's connected to crises of identity, existential crises, and so on. So there's terms like polycrisis, but also other terms like perma-crisis, the idea that it used to be the case that you maybe are in a crisis for a while, and being in a crisis tells you better do something different to get out of that crisis. So crisis is a kind of warning to act now, or something not good is likely to happen. Whereas now there's a lot of talk about the idea that we're in a sort of permanent state of crisis. You expect to be in a condition of crisis, and you see that for example, in economic domains, the way businesses now talk about what they're doing as businesses. They assume that they can't continue as they are at the moment for very long, and that they've got to constantly be looking for new outlets and opportunities to revise their program, because the future is unpredictable. And so crisis is relevant because it's seen as being the sign of our times. So social psychology is relevant to crisis in various ways. First of all, there's a long tradition within social psychology of asserting that the discipline is in crisis. So almost since its beginning, it's been in a state of crisis, and part of that is how to come to terms as a science with methods and techniques and know-how, with a subject matter that's quite difficult to define. So whether you define it as experience in social situations, or as how people behave when they're together rather than alone, or whichever definition of the discipline is adopted, it's quite a difficult subject matter to grasp and act on scientifically. And so the discipline itself has been in a state of perpetual crisis, but I think because of that has worked out some interesting ways of approaching quite complicated subject matters. So that's one of the reasons that I've become interested in the role of the arts in creating conditions which allow for experiences that allow people to make sense of their situation under times of crisis. Because one effect that can follow from being in a crisis is that, in a sense, things are coming at you too thick and fast. Your sense making is in some sense under threat or scrambled in some ways. And so in one sense you can catastrophize, you can think that the situation is worse than it is, and so bring about a catastrophe because you're expecting it into being, for example. Or on the other hand, you can pretend nothing is wrong and act like an ostrich with your head in the sand, and of course, if there really is something problematic happening, you will not improve the situation with that strategy. So there's various ways in which our sense making faces difficulties under crisis situations, and what the arts do is they create a space for experiences where you can reflect upon especially time. So you can play around with time. If you're an artist, for example, if you're a novelist, you might have a novel about let's say a crisis situation. Novels don't have to be about those things, but you can rearrange the time sequence. You can start at the end and put loops of time in the novel, and you can explore what happens to people in different situations, and in so doing, if you've done that in a lucid way, when people engage with that piece of work, in a sense they're getting a very interesting and rich meditation on their own sense making, but without having to look directly at their own sense making. So they can do it sort of by looking askance at somebody else's predicament, but still I think it's very helpful in terms of creating a space that's outside of the ordinary daily activities, the daily routines that dominate our lives. So you can create a space outside of normal life, but also a kind of time out of mind. So you're not necessarily in your own standard mindset. You're allowing yourself to be carried along by somebody else's story in some ways. But if that story is well written, lucid, and giving you really interesting information, then it can be a real aid to your own sense making. So whether it's painting or poetry or music or literature or theatre, I think the arts in general share this quality of providing resources for people which can be very interesting especially in times of crisis. Probably I can learn a lot from most young students anyway, because they are considerably more familiar with, for example, the impact of regular technological changes on sense making. So I'm somebody who's, when I started my career there were no computers, and so gradually began to adjust to computers, and since then there's been sort of technological revolution after revolution. So I'm very well aware that, for example, compared to people who are my daughter's age, say 20, I to some degree live in a different world to them, and that adjustment to the way in which, for example, technologies transform worlds would be an example of a sort of sense making being put to some degree under crisis by new technological developments. So first thing I think is that young students wanting to do cultural psychology know a lot already about this stuff, but perhaps there's not, perhaps where I can help is with providing a vocabulary that helps to articulate those kinds of experiences. And there, I think, the point that I made about social psychology having a long history of grappling with quite complex concepts, it means that we've got some rich ways of pulling ideas from different disciplines together, for example, to ask questions that are relevant to people's social lives today.